As probably most of us are familiar with the circumstances surrounding recent discussions about the Trinity, not a few claim that in order for us to be legitimately biblical Christians, we should deny the Trinity or the teachings about the Trinity, because these people say that the Trinity is not biblical. Sometimes these people are confused, young Christians. Others are influenced by certain trends in modern Christianity, which tends to reject or not to put that much value in the teachings about the Trinity, in the doctrine of the Trinity. We have some denominations that we know they do not accept the Trinity, such as Jehovah's Witnesses. We have the Mormons, and some branches of Protestantism which are labeled as Unitarians. So there are some groups of Christians out there who do not accept the doctrine of the Trinity. So given the confusion that exists surrounding the teachings or the doctrine of the Trinity, it's important for us to start this discussion of the Reformation and the Trinity with some biblical reflections on that most important topic. All Christians, basically, all mainstream Christians, they agree with some basic propositions about the nature, about the being of God. There are 5 basic propositions, which we are convinced are biblically based. And this basically forms the pillars of the teachings about the Trinity. There are 5. The first one is that there is one God. So I think every one of us would agree with that. And this is a teaching of mainstream Christianity throughout history. Second, the Father is God. So God the Father, or God the Father is God. The Father is God. Third, the Son is God. Fourth, the Spirit is God. Fifth, the Father, the Son, and the Spirit are distinguishable persons in relationship with one another. They are not merely different names for the one God. They are 3 persons inside the same divine Godhead. So we have these 5 propositions that basically all Christians are in agreement. However, these are not just philosophical musings. These are biblical teachings. As we go through the scriptures, we can support, we can prove each one of them that there is just one God. This is a clear teaching of the scriptures. There are dozens of passages that teach this basic pillar, this basic foundation of our understanding of the Godhead. There is one God. So you have Deuteronomy 6:4, 1 Samuel 2, verse 2, and then it goes on and on. Second pillar, the Father is God. Romans 1:7, 1 Corinthians 1:3, and many other passages. Number 3, the Son is God. So this proposition sometimes has been denied because throughout Christian history there are some heresies which have not accepted fully this affirmation that the Son is God. So we have the Arians in the first centuries of Christian history who could not accept the fact that Christ is God himself, that Christ is of the same essence of the Father. So, but this is a clear teaching of the scriptures, and we have many, many passages that affirm that Jesus Christ is God. Fourth, the Spirit is God. So those who accept the biblical evidence for the deity of the Son, they would seldom have any problems with the deity of the Spirit, because we also have many passages in which the Spirit is called God in the Bible. Fifth, the Father, the Son, and the Spirit are distinguishable persons in relationship with one another. They are not different names for God, as I explained before. So there are many passages in the Bible that emphasize and show clearly this reality. So we have passages in which the Son prays to the Father. Other passages, the Father speaks to the Son. Other passages, the Father, the Son, and the Spirit, all three appear together, but are clearly distinct from one another. We have the baptismal formula that we know well. We have passages in which the Father sends the Son and the Spirit. Other passages, the Son sends the Spirit. Passages show Father and Son loving one another. So this is a very clear teaching of the Scripture. So those who say that the doctrine of the Trinity is not biblical, they would have to prove it. But they haven't succeeded in doing that so far, because the biblical evidence is so strong that throughout history, mainstream Christianity have simply accepted the doctrine of the Trinity. How was that doctrine, that teaching about the Godhead, was understood by the Reformation? And so this is the main purpose of this presentation. So I have also five theses or 5 points that I want to make here in these moments. How did the Reformers? We know that the Reformers, they, of course, as the name, the label that is attached to them already defines them. They arose to reform the church. So they rejected many teachings of the Christianity of those days that were not in agreement with the Bible. So they rejected some of the crucial teachings of the church about salvation, about penance, the view of the church about the scriptures and tradition. They rejected that perception to propose that we should go by the Bible alone. So they were pretty much in tune with the Christianity of those days. They wanted to reform, they wanted to fix it. It doesn't mean that they got everything right. They were not perfect. They had a lot of light. They didn't have all the light, but they made a tremendous work. And we as Seventh-day Adventist Church, we are in the wake of the Reformation. We are continuing their work. So it's very important to look at what Luther, especially Luther and Calvin, what they taught about the Trinity. If the Trinity was not a biblical doctrine, as some people claim today, we would expect that the Reformers would have problems with the doctrine of the Trinity. But this is not what we see when we investigate their writings. And when I speak about the Reformers and the Trinity, I'm taking basically Luther and Calvin as representatives of the Reformers. There are some other Reformers, some were radical Reformers, but we are not going to these details because the idea here is just to give you an overview. As we look back into the Reformation, how did the Reformers understood the doctrine or the teachings about the Trinity? First thing, the first point that I want to make is that the Reformers did not reject the previous light on the doctrine of the Godhead. They did not throw off what was the teaching of the church at that point in regards to the Trinity. And this is something that we need to look into very closely. The problem is today is some groups, one of the basic accusations that they make against the doctrine of the Trinity is that the doctrine of the Trinity is a Catholic doctrine. So therefore, the church should just throw off this teaching. There are a couple of things that I want to consider about this claim. First of all, I think there is some kind of anachronism in that affirmation, because to say that the doctrine of the Trinity is Catholic is a bit complicated, because the big discussions about the Trinity, about the divinity of Jesus Christ and the inter-Trinitarian, let's say, relations, was taking place during the 3rd, 4th, 5th century. This is somewhat before the full-fledged Catholicism that arose when the Pope was declared the head of all the churches. Of course, the church was already in a path that would lead to the full Catholicism of the Middle Ages. But in the 4th century, 5th century, we cannot speak as we speak today of a Roman Catholic Church, in the sense that we speak today. So there's some kind of anachronism in this affirmation. Having said that, however, our concern when we discuss biblical teachings, biblical doctrines, and when we consider the Trinity, is not whether such a teaching or such a conception is Catholic or not. Our concern is, and this is what the Reformation were doing, the Reformers were doing, the question is this biblical or is not biblical? Because there may be things and ideas in the Catholic Church, because it's a Christian church, that may be right, and certain aspects may be biblical. Of course, there are a lot of distortions as well in many areas, but the fact that the Catholics hold one teaching doesn't mean that we need now to throw off the teaching because it's Catholic. The question is not it's Catholic or not. The question is it biblical or not? And when it comes to the Trinity, of course, the mainstream Christianity throughout the ages, coming from the Council of Nicaea, Chalcedon, and some of the big meetings that the church held in those times to discuss the issues of the Godhead, they did so under some philosophical framework within certain assumptions that we wouldn't follow today, because they go beyond what the Bible says about God. However, the basic idea that the God is in 3 persons, this is true. This is biblical. And of course, they were doing those meetings and trying to understand these things because they were propelled by the Bible. The evidence was there. God is more than one. So how can we explain? How can we understand that? So that's why they had the councils. The councils, of course, were pretty much involved with the culture of their day. They wanted to explain the doctrine of the Trinity to the intellectuals of those times, which were basically Neoplatonists. So they wanted to frame the doctrine of the Trinity in philosophical language. And that's where the problem lies. Not with the teaching about the Trinity in itself, but with the way it came to be explained. So the Reformers, seems that they understood quite well. And they did not reject the doctrine of the Trinity, but they avoided all the philosophical baggage that came with it. So this is the big lesson that we learn from the Reformers and their understanding of the Trinity. They were guided by the sola scriptura principle. So for them, if the Trinity can be proved from the Bible, that's truth. It's not whether the Trinity is Catholic or not, or it belongs to the Roman Church. For them, this was a biblical teaching. And this is something that we can learn with them. They were not necessarily trying to put discontinuity in everything. Whatever was true, they accept, as long as it's biblical. Second point that we learn from the Reformers is that they always, and they made strong efforts to frame, to understand, to explain the doctrine of the Trinity in a biblical way. They have not succeeded in every aspect of this effort, but it's very clear when we read the literature that they produce, especially Calvin, with the Institutes and some of the writings of Luther, that they try to explain the doctrine of the Trinity using biblical language. Some, of course, were more radical among them. Some would like to ditch the whole concept of the word Trinity. Some of the most, let's say, radical reformers, they wouldn't like even to use the term Trinity. Some of them because they simply did not accept the Trinity. They were tending towards Unitarianism. But others would accept the doctrine of God in 3 persons, but they wouldn't like the term Trinity. But in general, the Reformers thought that the best way to move forward is to retain the word Trinity, because it's the best word to explain all the concepts, all these complex ideas that the Bible conveys about God. Those 5 propositions that I mentioned to you about God. God is one, the Son is God, the Spirit is God, the Father is God, the three are one God, one essence in three persons. How can we communicate that without a specific and technical word for that? Of course, we can explain and mention these 5 propositions every time we are studying the topic. But when we mention the word Trinity, of course, it implies those ideas. So not every word that you use in church or in theology are necessarily words that are found in the Bible. So this shouldn't be a problem because language changes throughout history. And sometimes we need words to explain biblical concepts which are not in the Bible. For example, the expression or the phrase that uses investigative judgment. Where is that phrase found in the Bible? I don't remember that there's this phrase in the Bible. Nevertheless, this is a perfect phrase to describe what is happening in the heavenly sanctuary. So when we use the term Trinity, if we define this term, if we understand this term in biblical terms, this shouldn't be a problem. We received several letters in the General Conference from people asking that this term should be dropped from all of our literature because they have this idea that if you use the word Trinity, you are defending the Catholic idea of the Trinity. And this is not necessarily true. When we use Trinity, we're just referring to the biblical idea of a God in 3 persons, and that's it. Ellen White never used the term Trinity, probably because she didn't want to have the idea of Trinity mixed with what the Trinity or how the Trinity was understood in those times. But instead, she used the term heavenly trio or heavenly trio, which is basically the same thing. So she used the term clearly to refer to the Trinity, but with this phrase, heavenly trio. I'm not sure if this would be the best term to use today if people would understand in the way Ellen White is communicating the term. Because when Ellen White used the term heavenly trio, what she means is the Trinity. She's not separating or putting one person of the Godhead against each other. She's not understanding or conveying the sense of tritheism, which is 3 gods, is a different conception of God, which is a heresy. So for her, for those times, for what she wanted to convey, the term heavenly trio was fine. But for us today, the term Trinity probably is the easiest one, is the most well-known affirmation of the triunity of God. And so what we just retain, we use this term with the proviso that this is conveyed in a biblical way, not in a philosophical way. So the Reformers always sought biblical definitions, biblical terms to refer to the Trinity, to the triunity of God, but they retain the notion or the term Trinity. Third point, Luther, especially Luther, he sought to understand the Trinity in light of Christ. So Luther was profoundly committed to the solus Christus, which was one of the principles of the Reformation. Christ alone. So his understanding of God was based on his understanding of Christ, which is a biblical, of course, way to do it, because Christ himself said, Jesus himself said, the one who sees me sees the Father. So for Luther, he would understand the Trinity, he would understand the Godhead from his perception of Christ. And Luther was very radical sometimes, he used very strong words, and Luther once said that to look for God outside of Jesus is to encounter the devil, because you cannot understand God apart from Christ. So all his understandings of the Trinity was from the perspective of Christ, was through Christ. Number 4, Calvin articulated his understanding of the Trinity in the context of heresies. In the times of Calvin, there were several more radical reformers who were urging the church to throw off the doctrine of the Trinity. So Calvin spent a lot of time combating these people, arguing against them, writing against them, and trying to put the doctrine of the Trinity in biblical grounds. So lots of materials in Calvin were a response to these heretics who wanted to deny the doctrine of the Trinity. Some of them were fleeing from areas dominated by the Roman Church. And of course, they were being persecuted there, not just because they were not Catholics, but because they were denying the Trinity. So they would flee to Protestant areas, and there they would try to convince the churches, the Protestant churches, to abandon the Trinity. They were Unitarians. They were Unitarians because most of them were rationalists, and they understood the Trinity to be against reason, to be against logic. Therefore, the Trinity should be rejected. So a good amount of time Calvin spent trying to respond to these people and showing that the doctrine of the Trinity is a biblical teaching. It should not be rejected. You do not accept a doctrine because it's against reason or because it's against logic. Probably the fact that the doctrine of the Trinity is so difficult to understand from a rational perspective or from a logical perception, it's a proof that this is not a human invention. This is something biblical. It's something that God revealed in His Word. So for Calvin, this articulation of the doctrine of the Trinity was in the context of heresies. And this forced him to study the Bible and to explain the doctrine. Fifth and last, according to the Reformers, and especially Luther and even most Calvin, the Trinity is essential for justification. Without the Trinity, you would have to rewrite. You have to come up with a complete different understanding of salvation. You cannot understand the plan of salvation without the Trinity. Because what is justification? Justification is to be accepted before God on the basis of the merits of Christ. If there's no Trinity, if you disconnect Christ from God, from the Father, if the Spirit is not God, so everything becomes a mess. And the very understanding of the plan of salvation evaporates. So we will need to devise a new way, probably a pagan way of understanding salvation. Because for them, the Trinity is essential for justification, essential for salvation. And to conclude, neither Calvin nor Luther, by virtue of their fundamental biblical orientation and grounding, they engaged fully the scholastic method of reflection on the Trinity. So they didn't go to the philosophical details of the procession of the persons of the Trinity and all that language which is very difficult to understand. The scholastic way, that was, of course, accepted by the Roman Catholic Church, by Catholicism, and even some of the Eastern churches, was that there was an eternal generation of the Son and the eternal procession of the Spirit. This is a very philosophical way of trying to understand what is going on inside the Godhead. The Reformers were not concerned with those details. They were concerned with what the Bible taught about the doctrine of the Trinity. Sometimes they may not have been fully committed to the biblical language, but as far as I can understand, as I read about them, they were always struggling to find biblical ways of expressing the doctrine of the Trinity. So I think we have a lot to learn with them. And as we go through these again this afternoon, I hope to clarify some of these things as we go to the doctrine of the Trinity and the revival of anti-Trinitarianism and how the church can face these issues considering the challenge that we are having today. I think the time is up. I'm 4 minutes beyond the time. Sorry for that. And may the Lord bless you and have a wonderful Sabbath as we worship Him.